people do not want to think about death, especially when in context to their own mortality. However, coming to terms with this inevitable part of life can lead to self-fulfillment, understanding, and comfort when having to plan for the future. Within the realm of literature, poetry has been acknowledged as one of the most popular forms of understanding one's own deep life questions. The word death often brings about an amount of anxiety and fear, and because of this, there are many pieces of literature that focus on these popular feelings. For this presentation, I am focusing on 3 of the most read authors in the 19th century whose pieces are centered on death and understanding it. As Robert Carlyle states in his article titled "Finding the Words to Say It, the Healing Power of Poetry," he says, quote, "Finding the words to articulate traumatic experience can bring relief." End quote. In poetry, wording and structure is everything. Meanings and portrayal within the writer's words not only reflect the emotions behind the text, but transform the meaning of what is being focused on in the particular piece. In Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, the underlying message of fear, murder, and violence feed into the beliefs of death being horrifying. However, the topic of death does not have to be in a setting of horror and anxiety. Some poets that were published around the same time, such as Baudelaire and Dickinson, have written about the dying process and have used their works to understand and cope with the ending of life. Dickinson focuses on the unknown aspects such as afterlife and religious questions, while Baudelaire writes about the more physical processes of decaying and the cycle of life. By looking at these authors in contrast to the work of Robert Browning's My Last Duchess, I will show how structure, tone, and wording change the emotions and understandings of death. Although Robert Browning's My Last Duchess is not as direct about death as some of his other pieces, the structure and amount of aggression portrayed by the narrator continues the stigma of death being related to the Gothic and horror due to the amount of mystery and fear of murder being relevant within the writing. Before reading the monologue, the reader notices the format. At the end of every line of the sentence, they continue rather than stopping, thus making the poem overwhelming to look at. The text itself becomes overpowering and almost terrifying to read. However, when read, every couplet in a strong rhyme, thus leaving a haunting aspect to stick to the reader's memory. In regards to portrayal, the use of a painting resembling a dead mistress gives a distressing feeling and sparks many questions for the readers, especially in the growing aggravated tone of the narrator's statement. From the beginning, there is an eerie feel to the poem when the narrator states, "That's my last Duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive." As if she were alive. Automatically sends chills down the reader's back and begs them to find the death of her to be terrifying, thus feeding into the typical portrayal of death. A little farther into the poem, the narrator starts to explain why she is no longer alive, and in lines 23 through 27, it is noted that she was simply too full of life for the narrator's taste. Browning writes, "She had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. She'd like whatever she looked upon, and her looks went everywhere." With the Duchess portraying life and the narrator then being death, there is more fear sparked in the readers when placed in the position to contemplate their own mortality rather than coming to terms with it. With the narrator being the embodiment of death, he is portrayed as dark and untrustworthy to readers and only feeds into the fears that Western culture has long had about mortality. In contrast to Browning's work, Emily Dickinson is one of the most famous American writers to focus extensively on the topic of death. With her analysis of the afterlife and religious questions, her views on death are normally read with more of a calm nature, and as Thomas Ford states in his book about her, quote, "This theme was the most powerful and most enduring of her poetry," end quote. Dickinson wrote about death being in every aspect of her life, showing that understanding death equally gives an understanding of life. In her poem, "I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died," Dickinson uses dashes in the structure to bring about pauses and create the effect of silence and serene sadness in the room. Not only does she note the stillness in the room in lines 3 and 4, but she creates the stillness with her dashes. The silence does not get rid of the fear and sadness in the still room, but acknowledges it and does not add more to what is happening. lines 11 through 16, breaths were gathering firm for the last onset when the king be witnessed in the room. By noting the death to be a king, the feeling of a royal arrival or crowning shows anticipation and a calm understanding to the topic of mortality. Here, Dickinson is equating death to be a big anticipated event until the end when she says in lines 23 through 30, "There interposed a fly, with blue, uncertain, stumbling buzz, between the light and me. And then the windows failed, and then I could not see to see." The fly can be analyzed as being the actual embodiment of death, showing that death is not as big of a deal as everyone makes it. A fly being so small in every aspect of life is important in noting the normalcy of the onset of death in everyone's lives. By using a fly to symbolize and embody death and the slow-paced tone of the poem, the narrator is making it easier for readers to cope with their own and others' mortality. In another poem titled "If I Should Die," Dickinson writes about how life continuously keeps moving even after the death of someone. This portrayal of death shows a large amount of hope and comfort for readers who may be grieving. Structurally, the poem is full of commas and at the end of every line. Plus, there is a large use of the word "and." Here, the narrator in lines 2 through 5 says, "And you should live, and time should gurgle on, and morn should beam, and noon should burn." This technique helps the narrator note that all the things being written about will happen and continue together, showing that death will not end anything other than her own breath. As the poem continues, chosen imagery and wording gives a peaceful understanding to death and acceptance. By writing, "When we with daisies lie," Dickinson uses the peaceful and restful imagery in contrast to laying in a grave or something that would normally portray a Gothic view of death. Lastly, at the end of this work, in lines 15 through 16, she writes, "It makes the parting tranquil and keeps the soul serene." Using the word parting rather than decaying or simply dying, she creates She creates a peaceful feeling and acknowledgement of death. This may assist those who are anxious or terrified of the dying process. Although her works can assist some in coming to terms with death, there is an overuse of peace and tranquility. There needs to be a balance with the real-life aspects of death and the ethereal to create a strong connection and change in readers. Rather than creating a constant view of a beautiful ending, to be able to cope with the stigmatized horrors of death, there needs to be an amount of reality in writings on death to create a full understanding. With this being said, Baudelaire is a renowned French poet who has been translated a multitude of times. However, he also wrote in English for poems. The Carcass by Baudelaire is originally written in English. Since there is no need for translation, there is a direct example of the poet's tone on death. From the very beginning of the poem, in lines 1 and 2, the narrator entices and directly speaks to the reader, saying, "Remember that object we saw, dear soul, in the sweetness of summer morn." By using the words sweet and dear, the tone of the poem is created early on to prepare the readers for the onset of the topic concerning death in this piece. As the poem seemingly wanders along with the narrator explaining a peaceful walk until the reader and narrator come upon a corpse of a woman. The narrator explains her body not in a romanticized way, but by describing her as spread open, nonchalant, ripe, and rotting heap in lines 7 through 9. This blatant explanation of the body makes sure not to sugarcoat the realities of death and decomposition. However, continuing to line 11 by using the description of tender hundredfold to vast nature, he creates a serene tone around what would normally be traumatizing to others or anybody in that experience. The poem continues with, "The sky watched that superb carcass like a flower blossom out." With the body being explained as a flower, which is something gorgeous and full of life, it contrasts with the blatant decaying visualization, thus helping readers cope with both the realities and emotional intricacies of death. In the ending of the poem, the narrator tells that such a beautiful woman will also decay in such a way as the one in the text, thus telling the reader that death is a process to bring about another life. Although morbid for attention of the reader, Death is shown to be accepted and understood to be not afraid of the same process that they will one day go through. In the lines 37 through 41, Baudelaire states, "Yet to this rot you shall be like, to this horrid corruption, star of my eyes, sun of desire, you my angel and my passion, yes, such you shall be." With the amount of power that poetry has over the portrayal of things such as death and life, such works and future work can assist readers understanding human existence and come to terms with mortality. Death is not something to be feared, but to be prepared for and understood. Using imagery that sparks either too much horror or romanticizing can cause false emotions toward this cycle in life. Western culture has become terrified of death, and that only makes life full of anxiety and constant fear. Thank you.
Thank you, Sabrina. Questions?
There's such an emphasis and hope, I guess, on hoping to have people coming to terms. Would you yourself consider writing poetry to further that hope?
Absolutely. I don't see myself as super creative. I have been in the poetry classes and fiction writing classes, and I struggle with creativity, I think. However, I would love to maybe work on that sometime.
Maybe you could go into a little bit of the background. So, why for you death, and how did this project kind of become this culminating moment in your career?
Absolutely. So first of all, I was in one of my classes. It was either Dr. Pate or Dr. Nixon. I can't remember, and everything for the life of me, I can't remember which class it was. I learned about Baudelaire, and I fell in love with this man like no other. But I also have always had a fascination with the dying cycle, so decomposition, and I came to the reality not very long ago that I want to be a mortician in my very near future, which means going back to school. But I learned that through Shepherd. I've learned that I can use my analysis and passion, I guess, to combine into becoming possibly a blog writer or something that focuses on both together. And so since I absolutely love poetry that's about death, mostly Baudelaire, and mortuary work, I thought of putting this all together as my final thought. Yes?
So the carcass is written very beautifully. It's a beautiful poem to listen to, but it's explaining a rotten corpse laying here. And you explain that it's not romanticized. They're not kind of trying to sugarcoat it. So how do you explain the juxtaposition between the beautiful writing and the disgusting topic?
Absolutely. I absolutely love what Baudelaire does in this poem because he writes it so beautifully and romantic that you, as a reader, are able to follow through with the rest of the words because there is, I left them out for obvious reasons, but there's parts about worms in the body and like the body like turning into oozing things and
Dog trying to hit.
Right. So all these morbid things have to be contrasted with the romantic tone to get readers to actually continue to read through it without banning it like they did in France. Yes?
So I'm also fascinated by Baudelaire. I hadn't realized that the carcass was originally written in English.
Mm-hmm.
And the book is Flowers of Evil. Flowers of Evil. Evil is in the flowers. And I'm wondering what this, it's like this morbid fascination. What is its, is it initiating readers? What is its, you see it's kind of like, it's almost like a mirror of the traditional Catholic, Christian church view of, mortality. But the way Baudelaire does it, it challenges us to see it in a completely different way.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what he's doing. He wants to turn everything on top, like turn everything onto its head. And especially with Well, with the Catholic beliefs that were everywhere in France during this time, no one wanted to face death as something that can be planned for. And I think that has been fed into our American society. And I think Baudelaire was one of the starts to start questioning why we can't start thinking of death even in our youngest years. Yes?
Where did you run across the item that it was written in English? Because I've never encountered that.
So as I was researching, I could only find it in English, and my book that I have that's all French from Baudelaire, it's only his work. The carcass was in English, the rest were all in French. There's some that are English. However, the more I've studied, the more I've found that there is a French version of the carcass. So I might want to fix that in my paper.
I do think it was written, I mean, I don't want to be a jerk, but I think that it was written originally in French for the Fleur de Mal as a Chardon. And I've never encountered anything except an English translation of the original French. So I would suggest looking back at that to
Yes.
see if it's accurate.
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Sabrina.